Welcome to the Re-Quilibrium podcast. I'm Danielle LaCourte, and this is a conversation with behavioral scientist and researcher Ashley Whillans. Ashley is an assistant professor at Harvard Business School, and she's also obsessed with all things applied psychology. She has spent most of her life thinking about the intersection of time, money, happiness, and public policy. So, of course, I felt this podcast would not be complete without a conversation with her. So, in this conversation, we talk about time, how time affluence and time poverty play into things like meaning, happiness, life satisfaction, productivity, loneliness, and how time factors into our responsibility to each other. Ashley has a book out called Time Smart: How to Reclaim Your Time and Live a Happier Life. I've read it. It's great. I suggest you pick it up. And to learn more about her, check out this episode's page on daniellelacourte.com/podcast. As always, subscribe to Re-Quilibrium on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also sign up for Re-Quilibrium's email list at daniellelacourte.com/podcast for some exclusive content and to be notified of new episodes. If you've liked the content so far, rate me on Apple Podcasts, follow me on Medium, Instagram, or LinkedIn, or consider supporting me on Patreon at Danielle LaCourte, LeCourt. So now let's do this. Let's get right into it. My conversation with Ashley Whillans. Thank you for taking the time to join. I have to admit that I've been reading your book, Time Smart, ironically, in these stolen moments that I'm not chasing after my kids or getting work done. And I think it's an ironic scenario that kind of speaks to exactly what you talk about in the book. I think time is one of those things that has always been on people's minds. And I think the pandemic has only exacerbated those concerns. And I think people are really trying to figure out how to get this all dialed in this new world. So I wanted to start, if you can just launch into your definition. You kind of separate these two things of time poverty and time affluence. And I love the metaphors that you use around that. And I'm wondering if you can just start by orienting us with what you mean by these concepts.
Yeah, so they're really two sides of the same coin, how we feel about the time that we have available to us. And so I'm a social psychologist by training. I'm really interested in people's subjective interpretation of their experiences in their everyday life and how we feel about the resources that we have, how these feelings can shape our subjective well being. And what I mean by subjective well being is just overall life satisfaction. So when you take a step back, how well do you think you are doing in life? And then how much joy, stress, sadness, anxiety you experience on an everyday basis. When I'm talking about happiness, I'm really thinking about those two components, or the overall happiness we get in our lives and then how much joy we experience on an everyday basis. So I became really interested over the course of my dissertation and as a faculty member, trying to understand. We talk a lot about money. I mean, I'm in a business school. Obviously, we think and talk about negotiating for salary and assets and acquisitions and mergers, but we don't know a lot about time. It's a pretty amorphous concept. And the way that I think about time poverty and time affluence is, again, from the social psychological perspective, is the feeling of having enough time to do all the things that you want to do and have to do. So that's time affluence. And in contrast, time poverty is the feeling of being overwhelmed by the demands of work and life and feeling like you don't have enough time to do all the things that you want to do or have to do. And of course, people listening are probably like, well, I definitely feel more time poor. For me, when I think about time, the word time is synonymous with stress. And that's okay. That's most people. So, in my large scale survey data, all over the world, not just in the US is more time poor than most. We see that 80% of working adults report feeling time poor, like they have too many things to do and not enough time in the day to do them. And these feelings of time poverty can have stronger negative effects on our happiness than unemployment. So we can see that just the experience of feeling like you don't have enough time to do everything you want can have really negative consequences for our happiness, regardless of how much we work or how much money we have in the bank.
I love that you started out mentioning feelings. because it's something that I have been thinking about a lot, not only about time, but also as I have a lot of these conversations on Re-Quilibrium about well-being, a lot of it comes down to you can have these concrete tool sets for how to do anything well, but what you're up against often in the moment is how you feel, right? And we talked about that in terms of conflict management or in terms of pro-social behavior even. So that linking it back to the feeling of how your time or your experience of time in life, I think is really critical. I don't know if you can say more about that part of it.
So I think what you're talking about, but you can kind of like correct me if I'm wrong, is just that there is this kind of like bi-directional relationship, right? So if we feel happy, then maybe we're able to allocate our time in ways that are likely to promote more happiness. When maybe we feel better, we're able to invest in friends and family and social relationships. Yet when we're feeling stressed out, that might be more difficult to do. And so there is this really interesting dynamic where most people feel stressed out. And what I see in my data is that when we feel stressed out, when we feel overwhelmed, we actually engage in activities that are counterproductive to getting ourselves out of this time poverty trap. So we end up focusing more on work because it feels like a concrete goal. We'll work even more hours. We'll work on more trivial tasks. So this is one of the time traps I talk about in the book around the mere urgency effect, which I love because I also hate it. It consumes most of my life all of the time, which is when we're feeling stressed out, we actually gravitate toward doing lower level tasks like checking email or setting up meetings or attending meetings even because it gives us this boost of confidence, makes us feel in that moment that we're in control of our time, but of course it's actually causing long run time poverty because now we don't have enough time to spend on things that might take a little longer that are actually more important. And so it is a really interesting phenomena that I see in the data is just that when we aren't feeling very good, when we are feeling stressed, when we're not sure about our financial futures, when we're feeling uncertain or unhappy, we actually gravitate more toward activities that are going to be likely to make us feel more stressed out and are even less likely to engage what some people can think of as like self-care activities, what I think about as active leisure strategies like socializing, volunteering, helping others because we feel like we don't have enough time for it. So we end up in these perpetuating time poverty traps that are very hard to get out of. And that's really where I start in the book is really outlining some of these traps so that we can begin to recognize them in our own lives, take a step back from them, and in a very compassionate way, think about how we might be able to start slowly changing our behavior so we can feel more in control of our time, regardless of our starting point.
Why do you think we do gravitate towards those tasks? Because whenever I hear mention of behaviors that are counterproductive, my mind automatically goes to, okay, but they have to be offering something or else they wouldn't be the first thing that we do. So, what is it about those particular behaviors that are kind of counterproductive that is a draw in the moment when we are feeling stressed?
This is related to the psychological concept of medium maximization by Chris Shee at Booth, Chicago Booth School of Business, which I love. And when I think about time and money, it makes a lot of sense to me is that, human beings are goal focused. We've gotten to where we are in the world by setting a series of goals for ourselves and accomplishing them. So when goals are very concrete and specific, like working a set number of hours or having a certain amount of money in the bank or getting to our next promotion or even getting to the bottom of our inbox on a more daily basis, those goals are very concrete and tangible. We can see them in front of us. And so we want to check them off. We want to get through them. And that gives us self efficacy and confidence, the sense that we are in control of our lives in the moment, in this kind of like myopic sense. So, this is like related to self determination theory. Like, we want to feel good about ourselves, we want to feel confident. And all of these small behaviors, which take up time or might lead us to focus more on work, can help us like feel self confident in the moment, but of course, they're actually coming at a cost, and this is what we often don't realize, that they're coming at the cost of other really meaningful activities. So a lot of my research looks at time and money trade-offs and finds that regardless of how much money people have in the bank, they tend to focus more on work and making money, focus more on kind of lower level tasks, if you will, sometimes depending on the data set. And this is exactly because time and leisure and social relationships and quality of life, those are more abstract goals. They're harder to think about working towards. Like, what is it? mean to have quality time with my partner. Like I have some idea of that, but it feels like a less concrete goal. And so, especially when we're feeling stressed, we kind of look toward goals that we can maximize on that have a metric that has meaning or is numeric, like money or hours. And so, some of this tendency we see in the data for people to just kind of discount leisure or discount free time because they don't know what they would do with it. It doesn't feel productive. And we're especially likely to think it's unproductive when we're really stressed out.
It makes me think of a time version of junk food, of just we're gonna feel better for maybe about 5 seconds after we eat it, but then ultimately the long-term effect is worse.
Yeah, I love that analogy. And we do talk a little bit, like in the book, my editor and I kind of came up with this analogy very similar to what you're saying is that becoming more time affluent is like developing new habits. It is like becoming healthier. You can think more kind of like flexing your muscle of being deliberate about time, if you will. So we have a lot of examples, or he's not a co-author, but like I have a lot of examples in the book that we kind of generated together that are a little bit like, you actually do the first step is kind of noticing, are you binging on something
Mm.
that feels productive in the moment, like scrolling on social media or checking email? And if you're finding yourself doing that, that's probably not an activity that's bringing you a lot of joy. And it's also probably not a productive activity either. So it's probably an activity you actually want to think about minimizing in the context of your everyday life as opposed to doing more of. Most of us say we probably spend too much time on social media or checking our phones and not enough time in flow working on a really important project. Like we can all admit to that. And so it's really about finding yourself, catching yourself in those moments, asking you why you're doing that activity. Similarly, if you find yourself in the snack closet when you're working from home, like, am I hungry or am I just stressed? And often, similarly, we see that people are engaging in more of these mindless social media or email checking kind of feels productive in the moment, but not very productive in the long run behaviors when they're feeling stressed and anxious. Maybe it's before an upcoming meeting with a client, and so you can think about trying to recognize those behaviors and then substitute them for something that is more deliberate and intentional and purposeful. So I have some examples as well. Like you could just substitute that time that you spend scrolling on social media because you're anxious about an upcoming meeting with an activity that's going to actually help you directly deal with that anxiety, like listening to a mindfulness tape or going for a walk or spending some time with your friends or family. So I do think that that analogy of junk food is well taken, that there are lots of ways in which we systematically waste and undervalue our time on an everyday basis, kind of habitually, and not necessarily solving the root cause of the problem. So we can start to think about how we can be more intentional and deliberate and a little bit healthier in our time use decisions in a similar way we can think about food decisions.
Yeah, and not to beat this metaphor to death, but it seems like those swapping behaviors would be more time nutritious, like just actually doing something that's gonna bolster the situation and make it better, but again, goes back to that whole concept of feelings. It's funny because I was gonna lead this conversation here eventually, but let's just do it now because I wrote a question of how much of time poverty is an illusion, and the reason I ask that is because in my own work, for example, so let's say I'm working on a really hard project, or let's say I'm working on something that I know is going to be really time consuming if I avoid it. So, AKA, if I'm procrastinating, I'm still spending all of that time thinking about this thing that I need to do. So, by the time I actually get it done, I have procrastination time plus time spent makes the entire project feel like I spent way more time on it than I well, no, I did actually spend that much time on it, it just wasn't necessarily productive time. I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit. I don't know if you look at procrastination as a concept, but it seems to, again, point back to that feeling of when I'm afraid of a project I'm working on, I avoid it, but I'm not really avoiding it. So I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so there's some really interesting new work by one of my colleagues at Berkeley, Juliana Schroeder, who, with one of her students, studied this idea of whether we truly do optimize our time. And she finds that most people think that they should work on low level tasks before kind of delving into their harder task in a day. And their paper is aptly titled Eat the Frog First, because in contrast to our predictions, we actually perform better and get work done more efficiently and turn in higher quality output when we work on the hardest task first because we are less cognitively depleted. We can give our full attention to whatever task it might be. And similarly, I have a field experiment with some of my colleagues showing that a really simple time blocking exercise of putting 2 to 3 hours a day in your calendar, 2 to 3 times a week, where you're going to work on important but not urgent work. You're not going to check email. You won't take meetings during that time. You'll treat that as sacrosanct, as your most important meeting of the day, or as important as a meeting with your top client or your boss. That people who do that, and we randomly assigned two groups, busy executives, to two groups, one of these time blocking experimental groups, and one is scheduling as usual. And we find significant reductions of about 20% in burnout, significant increases of about 18% in efficiency. And we also see clients' satisfaction going up in the time blocking condition. And people again might think, well, if I don't make myself available, my client satisfaction scores will probably go down because I'm not being as constantly responsive as I usually am. But of course, everyone understands that other people have other things going on, and quality truly is the metric that matters. And so we do see that there are performance improvements as a result of blocking time that people sort of don't realize in advance. And then another point around what you're talking about, I think, gets to a really important concept of what you're asking, or what you asked in the first part of your question, which is how much of time poverty is perceptual versus real, like how much of it that we're actually so overwhelmed, there's not enough hours in the day, versus we're not optimizing our time, or we don't feel like there's enough hours in the day because of something we're doing or some way that we're feeling, that we're keeping so much inside our brains at one time. And this gets to a really important concept that was coined by Bridget Schultz, who I absolutely love, Washington Post journalist, wrote the book Overwhelmed, which I read in grad school and really put me on this trajectory of studying this topic in a very real way. I just thought that the points she brought up resonated so much with things I was seeing in my own life and with people around me. But she has this term called time confetti. And this is the idea. She does deep research in her book and basically shows that we have less discretionary time today than we did in previous decades, in part because of modern conveniences like technology, microwaves, laundry. But we feel busier than ever. And part of that is due to the constant disruption of our leisure, due to the ubiquitous experience that we have of having constant access to technology, to our email, to alerts, distractions. And so she talks about this concept of time confetti. So we used to have an hour of uninterrupted leisure, uninterrupted work, could do whatever we wanted to do. However, now, because of constant distraction due to various technological devices, or due to our own, during the COVID-19 pandemic, our own responsibilities kind of interfering with our work. So we're constantly switching back and forth between being a parent, being a spouse, and being an employee, which is why virtual work is more distracting, feels more distracting, and results in more hours for less productivity, or the same amount of productivity as pre-pandemic. And we can get into that more in detail if we want to unpack some of the findings, because it has been interesting. Whereas if you used to have an hour of free time where you could just really devote to whatever it is you're doing, now that same hour is fragmented into a million broken pieces of time, where you're not able to be as present in the moment because you're getting slacked, you're getting emailed, you're getting interrupted by family obligations if you're working from home. And so that a little bit reduces the amount of leisure from that full hour. But most importantly, from a psychological perspective, it pulls you out of the present and reminds you of all the other things you could or should be doing. And that is sort of what you are identifying, this cognitive load, this thinking about your projects and everything that you have to do, that does actually deplete your cognitive attention and undermines happiness, increases stress. So one of my colleagues at Georgetown, Kostadin Kushlev, and my former advisor Liz Dunn at UBC have this great study where they randomly assign working parents who are visiting a science museum with their kids to one of two conditions. In one condition, parents are told to keep their alerts on their phone on while they're walking through a science museum exhibit, and the other condition, they're told to keep their alerts off on their phone and minimize their phone use while going through that same exhibit. Parents who had their alerts on their phone on reported significantly less meaning from the experience. They felt lonelier, and they also felt a greater sense of opportunity cost because they were now thinking about all the other things they could be doing. And so they start asking themselves, should I be present in the moment? Like I'm being a bad parent because I'm thinking about work, but maybe I should go back to my desk and race home and finish this project because maybe that promotion is going to go to someone without kids, right? So you start kind of being reminded of all of the other ways in which you could be spending time. And that is very stressful and misery inducing, as you might imagine. And so it's not necessarily that we have less leisure, but our leisure is definitely less enjoyable today than it ever has been before, in part because we're getting constantly bombarded by reminders of more productive ways that we could be spending our time.
I want to emphasize 2 words that you just said in that study because as a person who's been having a lot of conversations about well-being and flourishing, that's alarming that they had less meaning and more loneliness. And I think, again, just the body of research around those 2 concepts in particular and their role in well-being. I don't know if you can speak to that a lot, but the I don't wanna say toxicity, but I'll just say that because I can't come up with another word right now, but the toxicity of loneliness on our well-being and the importance of meaning. I mean, that's a big deal.
Yeah, and it makes so much sense, I think, when we're thinking about time is the mechanism by which we have our quality social interactions, right? So if we are not present in the moment, if we're working even in the middle of beach vacations or at picnics with our family members, these intrusions of work into our personal life seem like a small decision. But as I like to say in my research, they really add up to a heavy cost over time and in subtle, pervasive ways that we might not even recognize soon enough, right? And can have really negative consequences for things like meaning and happiness over time. Because again, it's like any one email or any one work call you take at any one family function doesn't seem like much at the time, or it seems like an excusable behavior. But slowly, in the moment, I mean, their study is momentary. So it's like immediately you feel lonely, or immediately you kind of wonder why you were doing that. But it's really that those small, it's like a thousand cuts, right? It's like every time that you do that, you're pulling yourself out of a quality social experience that's so important for social connection, pulling yourself out of the present moment. And we know that mindfulness is so critical for meaning and understanding our purpose in life, for our happiness. And if you do that enough times, you're going to start to erode the quality of your social relationships and erode the quality of your life. And so that's what I try to emphasize too in my book is just that, yes, a lot of the studies I show, like a lot of the data that I show, right, is like, oh, if you're paid for performance incentives and money's really top of mind for you, so you're going to prioritize work over socializing with friends and family on any one day, that only looks like 30 minutes less time. But that's 30 minutes less every single day, day in and day out, or really unenjoyable leisure when you do have time off with the people you care about. And it's that slowly over time that starts to color and shape the quality of your entire experience. And I think that is one of the key messages I hope that some of the research on distraction and technology really underscores is that at any one given time, and it really doesn't seem very important or it doesn't seem very costly, but it's really becomes a very pervasive problem when we start looking across weeks or years, or like many researchers look at cohort studies and try to link technology to disconnection. And so it's really the kind of accumulation of these decisions over time that can have negative consequences for so many important facets of our lives.
It's so interesting to hear you say that because now that makes me think of basically how we speak about any lasting change in health a lot of times gets framed instead in terms of lifestyle and orientation. And so, in a way, it seems like you're describing a time lifestyle or a time orientation of who am I as a person in relationship to this subject. And then that is what then lays the foundation and the groundwork for better choices over time, is just completely changing the operating system.
Yeah, and we do. I mean, a lot of my work in this area came out of some initial studies where we exactly did this. We just tried to understand whether people's general orientation to prioritize and be deliberate with time in the context of their everyday lives promoted subjective well being. So we posed a really simple question to people in a couple of different ways, but this is just an example. We said, tell us who you're more like. Are you more like Taylor or are you more like Morgan? Taylor values time more than money, would be willing to give up money in order to have more time. Morgan values money more than time and is willing to give up time in order to have more money, such as by working more hours. And then we linked people's general proclivity to prioritize time or to prioritize money with a host of subjective psychological outcomes. And certainly we do see there is a time orientation that people seem to have. So we've run nationally representative panels with hundreds of thousands of people all over the world. We can even observe these differentiation between time and more money focused people at the country level. And we see sort of like over and over again that people who say they put time first report greater subjective well being, so greater life satisfaction, greater happiness, less stress. And part of that is because they are able to do things like capitalize on social interactions in the context of their everyday life. If you're more money or efficiency focused, you're going to spend less time. We show in our data that people spend about 18% less time getting to know someone new, getting to know a new peer. So they're not capitalizing on social interactions, maybe because it doesn't feel efficient, it doesn't feel productive. They need to move on to the next part of their day. Whereas people who are more time focused are willing to invest in new social relationships. They spend more time socializing with friends and family. They're more likely to volunteer. They're more civically engaged. They're really engaged in these constellation of other focused activities that we know are so critical for happiness. And it's not just tautological. So sometimes when people are, I'm talking to people about these findings, they say sure, but aren't happier people just more likely to prioritize time because they had better activities to spend with their time. And we've actually run longitudinal studies. You can't quite randomly assign people to have different values in life. So longitudinal is a pretty good way to go, where we looked at college students' general priorities or preferences rather around time and money. And so we asked about 2,000 college graduates whether they prioritize time or whether they prioritize money. And then we tracked them for 2 to 3 years after graduation. And so we saw that students who had this general proclivity, this general orientation to value time over money reported greater happiness 2 to 3 years later, even controlling for baseline levels of happiness, controlling for parental wealth, controlling for debt, and that those differences were driven in part by the choices that they made during this major life transition. So students who were more time focused chose careers or next steps after graduation that were more intrinsically motivated because they wanted to do the activity as opposed to more extrinsically motivated because they felt like they had to or they wanted to work toward a financial goal. And so those are just some examples, but there is this kind of default tendency that we all have to generally prioritize either time or work, money, and productivity. And of course, it's not a misery sentence if we're more money focused. I call myself out in the book. I say, of course, like after I graduated, took me 10 years of graduate studies or my education of between my BA, my MA, and my PhD to get a job for the first time. So of course I was definitely more money focused coming out of all of those years of school, just trying to catch up to people from my friends at home who got BAs and took jobs and are now on their second house and second kid and all of this stuff. And so it's totally fine to prioritize money and our orientation, although it's an individual difference, it does shift over the course of our lifetime a bit. So older adults are more likely to prioritize time. People who have financial goals are more likely to prioritize money. And of course, that makes sense. But it is a useful exercise to know where you start, where you're starting from, because again, these implicit prioritization or preferences that we have, a default way of thinking about the world in terms of either trying to get more leisure and protecting our time and being deliberate, or trying to get more money and trying to be more deliberate about our finances, can shape the decisions we make on an everyday basis, sometimes in ways that we don't fully appreciate. So another good kind of like first step to becoming more time affluent, at least what I argue for, is just knowing your default style. Again, being self-compassionate. You don't need to be mean to yourself if you're focused on money because you're trying to pay off student debt. That makes a whole lot of sense. But you just need to be aware that that might mean that you sometimes are focused too much on cost savings and not on quality time.
This is bringing up in my mind the intersection between this conversation about time affluence and conversations that I hear about productivity. There was a previous episode I had with Dr. Christy Seifert, who is based out of Westminster College, but we were talking about basically how the American culture at large talks about productivity as being the most exalted manifestation of time. And I can only see things from the context of my own lived experience. And as a single mom, feel very left out often of conversations of productivity because nobody ever talks about, like, I crushed it as a mom today, or I knocked so many to-do lists off of my deep social connection. People don't speak about that in these other areas of life that build out that nutrition, that well-being, that orientation toward life seems to get left out of this conversation about productivity. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
So I think this is really important, and I do talk about this as a time trap as well. So, especially in the US culture, we have this busyness as a status symbol mentality. Sylvia Beliza and her colleagues have this wonderful paper about this exact phenomena, showing that we in North America in particular exalt people who are always seeming to be too busy to have time to spend in any other way except like work or productivity. So they run all these studies and show that we give higher status to people who never seem to have a free moment, in part because we associate time scarcity with value. Anything that's scarce is valuable, and we use that same heuristic for the valuation of diamonds as we do for the valuation of others' time. And so we idolize, we hero worship people who never leave the office and seem to be always working, even if we aren't willing to say it explicitly. We don't want to seem materialistic or so focused on productivity. We have this kind of implicit belief that leisure is lazy, dating back to like Protestant work ethic, especially in the US. And so we give a lot of status to people who never seem to have any time available. This isn't true in other places in the world. They also have another study that they ran with one of their Italian colleagues where they find the opposite being true. So in Italy, if you work too much, if you never seem to have enough time, you're seen as being not very good at your life. And people who have a lot of leisure are like doing something right in life and they get a lot of
Mm.
high status. And so there are really strong social pressures, especially in the US context, to prioritize work at the expense of everything else, in part because that's what we see other people doing. And exactly to what you're saying, it's what we celebrate. And this, I think, is back to a really important point that I like to underscore in my research too is time poverty is not just an individual problem. Like, yes, there are psychological barriers that prevent us from being time affluent, but there are real social and structural factors that contribute to time poverty. This belief that leisure is lazy being one of them.
Mm. Mhm.
In the US, especially, I had published a paper with one of my postdocs a couple of years ago on looking at country level differences in the extent to which people value work or value leisure. And of course, we see in countries with a higher proportion of respondents who value leisure tend to be countries that have more social supports, that are more socialist, that have paid vacations, that people feel in those cultures that they can prioritize leisure, that they're not going to be penalized for it. And there are safety nets that allow them to make those decisions. Whereas in the US and other contexts where our healthcare, our mortgages, our childcare is all wrapped up in our work, of course we feel like we can't take time off because so much of our lives are wrapped up in our identity as the ideal worker. And so one thing I really do talk about and I'm starting to think a lot more about in my work is not just the role of individual decision making prompts to help people take control of their time, but what are the more systematic changes, the cultural changes, whether that's in a big C culture in an organization or micro cultures on teams? What are some of the ways in which we can start to shift the norms about how we talk about work and talk about leisure so that we can start to, exactly to your point, start celebrating, socializing, start truly relishing time off as opposed to seeing it as something that we need to hide from the people that we work with.
Yeah. When I was reading your book, there were 2 of the traps that stung a little bit, and I think they point back to what you're talking about with leisure because there was idleness aversion and the "yes, damn." Those are, I think, my 2 worst ones, but that idleness aversion especially, I think, speaks to this inability to rest and incapability for leisure. I don't know if you can speak about that one a little bit more, but it does seem to not only not prioritize leisure, but punish leisure.
Yeah, and so going back to this ideal worker norm, we've internalized the value of work to such a great extent in this country and in our cultural context that we can't even take any time off without worrying or without seeing it as a waste. And so there's a couple of studies that I love on this idea of idleness aversion, which is just the idea that like we have an impossible time doing nothing. So aversive, right? Like we can't imagine doing nothing. So we just fill our schedules all the time with anything to just avoid the feeling of not knowing what we're going to do with our time. And one study I love in particular is by a tenured faculty member in psychology, a pioneer of the happiness research field, Dan Gilbert, who was my advisor's advisor, made him feel old when I got a job at Harvard.
Your grand advisor.
Yeah, yeah, my grand advisor. He would not like me very much saying that. I do think I maybe said that to his face after a couple of glasses of wine once, and he was like,
Sure. Don't
"We
ever do
need to
that
stop
again.
talking."
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That's the end of that conversation. And he has a study with his colleagues showing that, well, he basically presents students with a choice, right? So he says, takes their phone away, of course, and he says, you can sit in this room for half an hour with only your thoughts, or you can sit in this room and blast yourself with mild electric shocks. And students would much rather blast themselves with mild electric shocks than be left alone in a room with only their thoughts because they don't want that. They just think that that may be the worst experience ever. They would rather put themselves in physical pain instead of dealing with that. And then it's not just college students that are so averse to idleness. There's also large scale studies showing that working adults will forego half days off. I saw this in a recent project I'm doing with a colleague. So working adults will like forego unexpected windfalls of time, like half a day off, because they don't know what they would do at that time. So they just want to work through it. This is why when organizations give like focus Fridays or like, oh, 3 hours off early, yet no one does that because they're like, literally, I don't know what I would be doing with this time anyway. And so maybe I should just work. I think probably all my colleagues are working. So maybe I'll just work through it. This is definitely, again, like it's a manifestation, I think, of how much we idolize work, especially in North American context. And then the yes, damn effect is basically part and parcel with this, but it has to do with the fact that we're not very good at accounting for our future time. So it's just the idea that we overcommit our future schedules. I mean, like, who doesn't do that? We all do that. I was laughing with a colleague because a time and happiness researcher, and we all study, we just say we study what we're bad at because that's why we become obsessed with it. You're like inherently so interested in why you keep making the same mistakes over and over again. And you don't necessarily update your behavior to the extent that you know something about the topic. And so I'm going on maternity leave soon. And my colleague was like, oh, yeah, I remember that I committed to a whole bunch of conferences 2 weeks before, 3 weeks before, like 3 weeks after that kid was born. And she's like,
Yeah.
yeah, you just need to remember you will not be able to do those things. And so I was joking with her that I have to get my husband to basically like jockey my calendar. Like I'm not allowed to make any of my own decisions because I will make terrible decisions. And so he is the one that will have to like manage my schedule for me. And so I will ask him, oh, can I travel for this? He says no. Can I do this? He says no. Can I do this? He says no. So it's just the idea, like this damn effect is the idea we always think we're going to have more time in the future. We don't adjust enough to account for the fact that we're probably going to be as busy tomorrow as we are today. The future calendars seem completely free, yet, of course, today is very busy. And so we end up in these time traps because we overcommit our future schedules. We say yes to too many things. And that's in part because it feels good, going back to the urgency effect. And we want to be a good person. We want to be a good friend. We want to be a good colleague. So we just have this default to yes. So a lot of the strategies I talk about in my research are about how can we set our default to no? How can we better say no? How can we negotiate for more time? How can we delegate more? How can we outsource more? Because these are not our defaults. Our defaults are to say yes and to assume very optimistically that we'll be way freer tomorrow than we are today. And again, it's kind of positive bias. It's not a bad thing. If we all were completely honest about how busy we were in the future, maybe none of us would get up in the morning. Right? Like maybe we would just throw the towel in. So it's not
Yeah.
necessarily a bad thing. Again, a lot of these biases come out of perfectly adaptive, healthy human psychology. It's just that when taken to an extreme degree, it means that we overbook our calendars, end up running around every day all the time. And we're seeing this a lot actually with COVID, right? Because things are opening up and now everyone's so excited to get back to doing everything that they're doing everything simultaneously. And so we're going to be back right where we started if we're not careful.
And maybe worse.
Probably worse. Yeah.
Yeah.
At least for a little while.
I think touching on the pandemic and touching on going on maternity leave, which congratulations, by the
Thank
way.
you.
I think I took 3 weeks off after my first one was born for the exact same reason of just, well, I have stuff to do and life goes on and
Yeah, I know I'm already seeing things in my calendar and I'm like, I see we're gonna have to figure out childcare and I
yeah.
wonder if I will be all together in one piece. Probably not. Probably that first meeting I scheduled, I should unschedule right
Yeah.
now.
I'm gonna go ahead and say yes, do that. For sure, unschedule it right now. I don't even know what it is. Something that I think that we've done as a culture well is I think I've been seeing a lot more conversation about boundaries, and mostly the ones that I see, though, have to do with relationships, like setting relationship boundaries, but I think that it's a really interesting thought when you talk about the intrusions of whether it's push notifications or work or things like that that actually take away from meaningful experiences and add to loneliness in the moment. It seems like it's a really good opportunity to start introducing more conversations about boundaries for time.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. So to kind of walk through that we've really observed coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this has been a terrible time. It's also been a really interesting intellectual time for someone who studies happiness and how people spend time on an everyday basis. Because for so many people who found themselves, of course, this is not everyone's experience, but for many people who are knowledge workers who found themselves working from home, COVID-19 pandemic provides a perfect opportunity to take back some of our time, right? So we should be able to spend less time commuting and we're not traveling for work. We're doing all of our conferences virtually. So we should be receiving, and someone else, as my colleagues and I did, billions of additional hours of free time. And yet, what we observed in the data is quite the opposite. So, what we observed in the data is a perfect example of Parkinson's law. Work expanded to fill the additional time we gave it. So the workday expanded by about 50 minutes, which was about the amount of time that we spent commuting to the office pre pandemic. And if anything, you see that in some of our survey data and some objective data collected by my colleagues, that the workday got much more filled with these distractions. People were sending emails after hours, they were having meetings after hours, and remote workers felt more distracted than ever, in part because of these constant disruptions, both of their personal lives. Obviously, when you're navigating the pandemic with young kids at home, you have constant distraction. And then also due to workplace distraction. And so one economic paper found that it took knowledge workers 20% more time to get to the same level of productive output while working virtually because of this constant distraction due to technology and personal responsibility. And so, coming out of the pandemic, one thing that we've been trying to do, a large project with a management consulting firm where we've been trying to optimize work hygiene, recreate norms in this virtual or hybrid model that we might be in for a little while. We'll see where this all goes. And it's exactly around creating breaks, boundaries, and transitions that often go missing in the virtual environment. And not only are these important for our sanity, for our health, for our happiness, but also these breaks and boundaries are really important for our social relationships, both at work and outside of it. One thing we are observing in our research with consultants is that the hallway conversations between meetings were not only a source of belonging and chit chat, but also a really important opportunity to sense make what just happened. So what we were hearing is so many more people were in meetings because it was easier to invite people to meetings, or if you were on multiple projects that were in different geographic regions that you would have never been able to go to both meetings on the same day. Now you can easily, with one click of a button, join a new meeting. And so everyone is kind of getting full visibility into the meetings that are happening, but fewer people are understanding what's going on because these small breaks in between meetings are going missing. And maybe we're filling them instead with email as opposed to natural, spontaneous conversation. And so, one thing that we've been experimenting with is the idea of collective time. So, thinking about time again, not just as an individual resource to be managed, but as something that as a team we can start to manage and take advantage of and start to plan for. So, what we were doing really simple experiments like having rules around when you were not going to check email at night. So instead of checking email and replying anytime and whenever, we're going to say we're not going to check email between 6 to 8 p.m. as a team. So there's no expectation that anyone's going to be on between 6 to 8. And that way we can have dinner, we can spend some time with our families, we can exercise. Same for 12 to 1. Maybe we just have lunch remotely, separately. We can work, we can do something, but we're not expected to be constantly responsive. So I think even these simple strategies can go a long way because as soon as you see an email in your inbox, our proclivity is to naturally check it, to think it's urgent, to get that boost of confidence and address it right away. So if we start setting these norms at the level of the collective, this can go a long way in helping people feel like they have more control over their time.
Can you say a little bit more about the transitions also? Because this is something I actually learned a lot about as a mom, and it was a parenting technique that was recommended in order to help move kids from one thing to another. But I think that that's the one that I struggle with and forget about a lot. And I think it's really important.
So, in the context of virtual work, we've been thinking about transitions as not only kind of physical location transitions, but also role transitions. So, we've been encouraging employees to think, I mean, one thing that a commute might be kind of terrible, and we know that being stuck in traffic is not very good for anyone's happiness, but the optimal amount of commuting is not zero. So, the optimal commuting from an older paper, so who knows what the estimates are now, but we'll just take this with a grain of salt, is about 16 minutes because commuting actually provides you with the physical separation between work and home. So you're a mom, you're a partner, you're a caregiver in your house, and then you get that 16 minutes or however long to transition into your professional identity. And so these transitions are so important because they help us create this mental separation that's needed to protect against these feelings of fragmentation that we've been talking a lot about, to protect against these feelings of time poverty, of being in so many directions at once. And again, they went completely missing in the virtual environment. And so we had one very simple strategy we were encouraging people, and one of my colleagues actually got Microsoft to do this, is to put a virtual commute on employees' calendars so they can't take meetings first thing in the morning when they would have been commuting, so between 8 to 9 a.m. And instead, they're encouraged to do something else with that time that's not work related to kind of mirror the transition you might have had otherwise while commuting to the office. So this, you could cook a breakfast for your family, you could get your kids ready, you could go for a walk around the block, but you weren't supposed to take meetings during that time. So you could mentally transition between work and personal. And similarly, at the end of the day, we've also been advocating for having a clear demarcation at the end of the day as you would a commute. So it's been harder for people to disconnect in a virtual environment. Again, you always want to seem on and available because you're not seeing each other work. You're not going to the same physical office space, maybe at least for now. So we've been advocating for like putting a workout in your calendar or a walk or a family activity so that you have a mental transition in your mind to say, oh, now I'm shutting off my work self. We've even gone as far, like I've done this in my own life, and I've heard in my interviews of people doing something similar, which is creating physical separation. So I have my office, my home office, which is just basically in my second bedroom, whatever, like closet office. And I don't come in here on the weekend. Like I refuse to come in here on the weekend. If I have to send some emails, I'll do it in the living room. But this is my work office space. And when I'm not supposed to be working, I'm not in here. I've heard other people have two phones, two computers for the same kind of ease of transitioning between different parts of their life now that so much of our lives is mediated by our technology.
Yeah, I mean, you're singing my tune here because I'm literally sitting here next to my bed in my bedroom office. It's funny, I normally haven't found devices that have actually helped with this, but this is the one area, and they don't sponsor the podcast or anything, but I got the Timular device, and the nice thing about it is it's an actual thing that you can hold and you just kinda move it around based on what you're doing, to where now I have a visual cue, and I'm actually allotted one to spending time with my kids, and so if I see that color facing up, I can look over at my desk and be like, "Oh, yeah, I'm spending time with my kids," so it's been nice to have that visual cue in lieu of having an ability to have a different space, because I'm not in a position where I can have that. And maybe lastly, I know we've only got a couple minutes left. I want to touch on something that you touched on in the book that I think is an important point. you brought up privilege and whether or not all of this is simply just a luxury for people of a certain socioeconomic status or a group of society. And you made the point that this is actually borne out in the research to be a benefit to everyone and something that's accessible to everyone. Can you talk about that aspect of it?
I think it's really important to recognize that time poverty is pervasive for different reasons in the entire population. There's a lot of research suggesting that lower income individuals have a lot of negative outcomes as a result of being time poor because they have uncertain schedules. So maybe they get last minute shift work. They never know when they're going to be working. So they have to take on multiple jobs to pay the bills. They live further away from their places of employment. They might have less sporadic access to reliable transit. And all of these social systematic factors create a lot of time poverty for people who are struggling to make ends meet. And so poverty is not just something that has negative psychological consequences because of the financial constraints, but also something that has negative psychological consequences because of the temporal constraints. And so of course, we're time poor for different reasons, and people with more money might be able to more easily outsource. But I think this application of thinking about the implications of time poverty for people struggling to make ends meet is something we need to talk about more because, for example, I've been running studies in Kenya and India that are on female economic empowerment, and we see that, well, girls and women spend in India will spend 8 to 10 hours a day collecting water. And that comes obviously at the direct consequence of them being able to go to school. To remove the burden of unpaid labor, you remove the time demand, and then allow these girls and women with some subsidy for the education to go to school and have potentially a different future than they would have otherwise. So I've become really interested in starting to think about time poverty as something that governments and societies need to take very seriously. Cass Sunstein, a professor at the law school, talks about this as well in terms of ordeal costs. So if you want someone to use a government service, you have to make it frictionless. But a lot of our government services, our social services, are hard to use, involve a lot of paperwork, involve sitting at an office in the middle of the day, which people who are struggling to make ends meet might not be able to do or might have to cancel appointments last minute because of their work schedules. And so I think thinking about both the social causes, but also the social solutions to time poverty, not just for kind of like among working, like knowledge workers and white collar professionals, but also thinking about how time poverty plays a role for people struggling to make ends meet will go a long way in improving the welfare of society overall. I think we often generally neglect to think about time poverty when we're thinking about structural solutions to really important problems like income inequality or why don't more first generation students go to school. But I think a lot of the solutions that need to be taken into consideration involve changing how easy a service is to get or how long you're making someone wait or making a service more timely. So this is really where I've started to put a lot of my research attention and focus is understanding the causes, consequences, and potential solutions for time poverty for people living across the income spectrum.
Well, and I like that that ties it back to something that you said earlier too, when you were talking about collective time and how this is not simply an individual problem. And I think that that's a really great tie back to that concept of we're all in this together and ultimately in the end. And if things are benefiting all of us, then they're benefiting all of us. And so I think that that's a really great way to think about it while also kind of mitigating and structuring our own individual lives for the most optimal and nutritious use of our time. Well, Ashley, this was an amazing conversation. I wanted to say thank you for your time, but now that seems like a loaded statement. But I really appreciate you coming on to talk about this, and I look forward to meeting you this November.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this conversation with Ashley Whillans. I always appreciate when people approach their subject of expertise with holism and compassion. And I found Ashley's perspective really well rounded and concerned with both individual and common good. Again, her book is Time Smart: How to Reclaim Your Time and Live a Happier Life. So if you're interested in learning more about the concepts we discussed, be sure to pick that up. I will also provide additional information for some of the concepts she mentioned, like self-determination theory and Parkinson's law, on the show notes page, since I know many of you enjoy learning more about the research. As always, I'm interested to hear what you think about this episode or the podcast as a whole. So comment on YouTube, reach out to me via my website, daniellelacourte.com, or message me on LinkedIn or Instagram with your feedback. Take care.